A humanitarian crisis is emerging out of Pakistan after the government ordered the forced expulsion of some 1.7 million Afghan refugees living in the country. And groups say that to avoid arrest, Afghan families are being forced to flee their homes without access to food, water, electricity, shelter, or plumbing. Joining us now to break down what exactly is happening in Pakistan is Adam Weinstein, Deputy Director of the Middle East Program at the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Welcome to the show, Adam.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So I think many people are coming relatively fresh to this crisis. Can you start by explaining why it is that there are so many Afghan refugees living in Pakistan to begin with?
Well, Pakistan has hosted millions of Afghan refugees over the last 40 years or so, even longer, we could say, but especially over the last 40 years. And many of them came during the anti-Soviet jihad that occurred in the 80s, and then the civil war that followed, and then the war on terror that followed that. So we've seen this steady influx of Afghan refugees over the years who are fleeing conflict. And then another driver is that the Durand line, which divides Afghanistan and Pakistan, many Pashtun communities have relatives on both sides of that border. So you have people with family who are Pakistani nationals or Afghan nationals. So families are quite literally divided by the border. And then you also have conflict that has driven refugees into Pakistan, and then also to some extent migrants who are just seeking work.
So why now is Pakistan moving to expel these almost over a million, almost 2 million refugees?
Well, Pakistan has sought to expel the refugees for many years. In fact, it was one of the demands they used to bring to the table with the United States in exchange for helping with talks with the Taliban. So it's not new. Some of the Afghan refugees in Pakistan are registered under the UNHCR, and then some of them are undocumented. Around 1.7 million are undocumented, and those are the refugees that Pakistan is looking to expel, even though some of them were even born in Pakistan. And the reason there's such a drive to do it now is frankly, I think the Pakistani state is scapegoating the Afghan refugees to some degree, and they're blaming them for a couple things. There's the TTP violence, which is the TTP is sometimes interchangeably called the Pakistani Taliban, and so some of that violence has been blamed on Afghan refugees, although I'd argue it's more homegrown. A second reason is that they're trying to put pressure on the Afghan Taliban to rein in the TTP because the Afghan Taliban and the TTP have a close relationship. And the Pakistani state thinks if it expels all these refugees and the remittances that go back to Afghanistan stop, it will put pressure on the Afghan Taliban to rein in the TTP through embarrassing them and through putting an end to the remittances. And a third reason is that there's a widely held belief among Pakistanis, among the general public and among the Pakistani government, that Afghans have been hoarding US dollars and sending those US dollars back to Afghanistan, and that is messing with the exchange rate. There's some truth to that. A lot of US dollars have flown to Afghanistan from Pakistan, but I don't think that's the primary driver of Pakistan's economic problems. So in short, I'd say they're being scapegoated. And in an attempt of having a rally around the flag effect, the Pakistani government thinks if it expels these refugees, their problems will be solved.
We're not hearing a lot about this in Western media. There's not a lot of reporting going on about it. Is that because we're so distracted by what's going on with Israel and Hamas right now?
I think that's part of it. I think the Americans in general don't realize just how much other countries have to take on the burden of refugees that, frankly, our wars create. Not only our wars, but to a large degree, our wars, our post 9/11 wars have created a refugee crisis. And so you see Afghan refugees going to Iran, you see them going to Pakistan, you see them go to Turkey. And these are countries that have absorbed millions of refugees. And as critical as I am of the Pakistani state's decision to expel these refugees, I'm even more critical of the fact that the United States can't even seem to process former interpreters who worked alongside U.S. troops. So it's very easy for us to say, how could Pakistan possibly do this? But we have all sorts of administrative and bureaucratic excuses for our inability to process far fewer Afghan refugees. But the reason I think it's out of sight and out of mind is because it's far away. Most Americans stopped paying attention to Afghanistan as soon as the last U.S. soldier left. And also, as you alluded to, we have this information overload from the conflict in Gaza.
Well, also, I mean, it's not new that we ignore events halfway around the world. I mean, a third of Pakistan was under water, and the historic flooding last year, almost 1,500 people died, and I saw nary a peep of it really in the mainstream press. So I do think that what's going on in Gaza does have an effect here. But I'm a little skeptical of the narratives that say that people who are invested in the humanitarian crisis in Gaza are kind of having a selective interest here and uniquely, indifferent to causes around the world. I really do think it's a little bit of a coverage issue, which is why I'm so grateful to have you with us today. You talked a little bit about the maybe hypocrisy of the United States having played a role in causing this conflict, and also expecting there to be an administrative resources devoted to resolving it in a way that we don't have in our own country with a much smaller volume of immigrants. What do you see as the most auspicious resolution of a conflict like this? It doesn't seem like there's a lot of interest within Pakistan, as you describe it, to suddenly have an about-face and more sympathetic view toward these almost 2 million Afghans who've been living there.
Well, some members of Pakistani civil society have advocated for letting the refugees stay, and of course, many of the refugees are Pashtuns, and there's a large Pashtun population in Pakistan as well. In fact, the city in the world that has the most Pashtuns is Karachi, Pakistan. It's not a city in Afghanistan, even though the more Pashtuns live in Afghanistan. But I think the majority of Pakistanis have to some degree bought the narrative that these refugees are causing an unfair burden on the Pakistani state and the Pakistani people. And of course, that narrative is quite easy to sell because the economy in Pakistan is so dismal right now, and there's political unrest and there's rising terrorism. So I don't see an about-face happening anytime soon. The refugees I really feel sorry for in particular are those Afghan refugees who were either born or grew up in Pakistan, and the only country they ever knew was Pakistan. They've gone to school in Pakistan, especially young women who have gone to school in Pakistan, and now they're essentially returning to a country they've never known. And in the case of the girls and women, they're not going to be able to go to school or go to work. So it's going to be a drastic change for them, and it's a humanitarian disaster. There's no other way to put it. But then again, I have to say that the United States has really fallen short in that we haven't even evacuated and granted visas to all of the individuals who directly helped us, let alone an influx of millions of Afghans who had no connection necessarily to our war. So we haven't even accomplished the minimum in this country. So that, of course, that doesn't excuse what the Pakistani state is doing, but it does put it into perspective.
Adam, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.